Good morning, y'all. I know the title on this one sounds like a 5-alarm fire, and I want to address that directly before we get into anything else, because I think how I handle a title like this says a lot about what kind of channel I want to run. There is no single earthquake happening right now that justifies dropping everything. What there is, genuinely, is a cluster of real, significant fault line stories that have all surfaced within roughly the same stretch of months, spanning from the Yukon down through California and out to the East Coast. And I think stacking them together into one comprehensive update is exactly the kind of urgent that actually deserves your attention. The urgency of staying informed, not the urgency of panic. Let me walk you all through all 4 of these stories. Let's start way up north, because this is genuinely one of the most surprising earthquake stories I have come across recently. High in Canada's Yukon Territory, scientists have identified a fault that appears to be waking up after a remarkably long sleep. A new study published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters focuses on a formation called the Tintina Fault, a roughly 620-mile fracture in the Earth's crust that cuts northwest across the Yukon and terminates in Alaska. According to lead author Theron Finley, a recent PhD graduate from the University of Victoria, this fault has been mostly still for the past 12,000 years, but the new research suggests it appears to be building towards significant activity. I want to be precise about the evidence behind that conclusion, because it matters for how seriously to weigh it. Finley's team noted that over the past couple of decades, only a few small earthquakes measuring magnitude 3 to 4 have been detected along the Tintina Fault. Nothing on its own that would suggest the fault is capable of a large rupture. What changed the picture is detailed geological mapping of the fault's surface expression, evidence of past large displacement events preserved in the landscape itself, which led researchers to conclude the fault is capable of far larger earthquakes than its recent quiet seismic record alone would suggest. I want to explain why this particular story caught my attention, because it touches on a genuinely important, broader concept in earthquake science. A fault's recent seismic record, meaning the earthquake's instruments have actually detected over the past few decades, is often a poor guide to that same fault's true long-term capability, especially for faults that rupture only rarely, every few thousand years, with long, quiet stretches in between. The Tintina Fault, sitting essentially dormant for 12,000 years, does not mean it is incapable of a major earthquake. It may simply mean the fault is deep into one of exactly those long, quiet interseismic periods, slowly accumulating stress the entire time. A stress load that the new mapping suggests may now be substantial. The community most directly in this fault's path is Dawson City, a Yukon town of about 1,600 people, along with several other communities across the region. I want to be clear that this research does not predict an earthquake is coming on any specific timeline. It identifies a fault with more capability for a large, damaging rupture than previously assumed, which is exactly the kind of finding that should inform future building codes and regional hazard planning in this specific corner of North America, not a countdown clock for anybody currently living there. Let me move you all down to California now, because a second genuinely significant fault story has been developing there. Much of the public conversation about California earthquake risk understandably centers on the San Andreas Fault itself. But a new study has drawn fresh attention to one of its close relatives, the Hayward Fault, which runs roughly 74 miles directly through the San Francisco Bay Area, cutting beneath cities including Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, and Fremont. According to the UC Berkeley Seismology Lab, the past 5 major earthquakes on the Hayward Fault have occurred roughly every 140 years on average, and the fault's last major event struck back in 1868. Do the simple math on that timeline, and you land on a fault that is now well beyond its own average historical recurrence interval. A recent study specifically modeled what would happen if the Hayward Fault produced a magnitude 7.0 earthquake, and the results are genuinely concerning, projecting widespread damage across one of the most densely populated, economically significant metropolitan regions in the entire country. I want to give you all the same honest caveat here that I give with any story framed around a fault being overdue, because I think this specific word gets misunderstood constantly. A 140-year average recurrence interval is exactly that, an average, built from a relatively small sample of just 5 historical earthquakes. And individual intervals between major earthquakes on any given fault can vary considerably around that average, sometimes running shorter, sometimes running dramatically longer. Being past the average interval increases the statistical odds of a rupture happening at some point, but it does not function like a scheduled appointment. The fault is somehow obligated to keep on a specific date. What this research genuinely tells us is that the Hayward Fault represents a serious, well-documented, and currently active area of seismic hazard research. Exactly the kind of fault that deserves continued monitoring and continued investment in earthquake-resistant infrastructure across the communities sitting directly above it. Now let me bring y'all all the way east, because a genuinely fascinating, if less dramatic fault story emerged from New Jersey following a real earthquake that struck the region. After a felt earthquake rattled the broader New York City metropolitan area, scientists conducting follow-up research identified a previously unmapped fault in New Jersey. According to reporting on the Discovery, researchers say this newly identified fault could help them better predict larger earthquakes across a region stretching as far as New York City itself. I want to explain why finding a new fault in a place like New Jersey is scientifically significant in its own right, beyond just this one specific discovery. The eastern United States sits in what geologists call an intraplate setting, meaning it is not positioned along an active tectonic plate boundary the way California is, and earthquakes in this kind of setting are generally rarer and, critically, considerably harder to study and predict, since the underlying fault network is often poorly mapped compared to a well-studied plate boundary region. Every newly identified fault in a region like the Northeast genuinely adds a meaningful piece to a puzzle that remains far less complete than California's own extensively studied fault network. Let me also bring back the New Madrid seismic zone, because I think any comprehensive roundup of major U.S. fault hazards has to include it, even though it did not generate a brand new headline this specific week. This fault system, spanning parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, produced 3 earthquakes estimated between magnitudes 7, 5, and 8. One back in 1811 and 1812, among the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the contiguous United States. Today, the same fault system threatens an estimated 15 million people across a region considerably less prepared for major earthquake shaking than California, given that building codes across much of the central United States have historically not incorporated the same rigorous seismic design standards found further west. I want to explain why that specific detail, unprepared building stock, matters so much here. Research on this exact fault system has found that the damage area from a comparable magnitude event in this region could be roughly 20 times larger than an equivalent earthquake striking California, specifically because the central U.S.'s older, denser crust transmits seismic energy far more efficiently over long distances, a concept I have explained on this channel before, spreading damaging shaking across cities including Memphis, St. Louis, Nashville, Evansville, Little Rock, and Paducah all at once, rather than concentrating damage in a smaller, more contained area the way a comparable West Coast earthquake typically would. I also want to bring in a real historical example that illustrates exactly the kind of scenario all this ongoing fault research is trying to help communities prepare for. Back in July of 2019, a magnitude 6. 4 earthquakes struck the Mojave Desert near Ridgecrest, California, followed roughly 34 hours later by a considerably more powerful magnitude 7. One earthquake in the same area, a sequence seismologists later determined meant the first, already significant quake had actually been a foreshock to the second, larger event. That second earthquake ranked as Southern California's most powerful since a comparable magnitude, 7. One quake had struck near a Marine Corps base in the same general desert region back in 1999. The Ridgecrest sequence caused structural fires driven by ruptured gas lines, water main breaks, and widespread power and communications outages across the city, prompting California's governor to request federal assistance and place the state's Office of Emergency Services on its highest alert level. I want you all to notice something genuinely important buried in that story, though. Despite the sheer power of that 7, one main shock, no fatalities or serious injuries were reported from either quake in the sequence. That outcome reflects decades of exactly the kind of seismic building code investment and public earthquake preparedness education that stories like today's 4 fault updates are ultimately meant to inform and improve further. A genuine success story worth remembering alongside any discussion of California's ongoing earthquake risk. I also want to mention the technology that increasingly stands between a community and exactly this kind of sudden damaging earthquake, because it connects directly to why continued fault research matters so much practically. California, Oregon, and Washington now operate Shake Alert, an earthquake early warning system capable of detecting an earthquake's initial, faster traveling but less destructive waves and issuing a public alert with several seconds, sometimes up to a full minute, of advance warning before the slower, more damaging shaking actually arrives at a specific location. That system has already demonstrated genuine practical value, though it is not infallible. The USGS itself has publicly documented instances of false alerts, including one affecting the Carson City, Nevada area tied to a magnitude 5. 9 earthquake late last year, a reminder that even mature, well-funded early warning infrastructure continues to be refined and improved based on real-world performance data. Continued fault mapping research, exactly like the 4 studies I have walked y'all through this morning, feeds directly into improving systems like Shake Alert over time, since better understanding of exactly how a specific fault ruptures helps refine the algorithms responsible for accurately and quickly detecting that same kind of rupture in real time. I also want to walk y'all through the basic classification system geologists use to describe faults, because it helps explain why these 4 very different faults behave and get studied so differently from one another. Faults generally fall into 3 broad categories based on how the rock on either side actually moves. Strike-slip faults, like the San Andreas and the Hayward Fault I described a moment ago, involve 2 blocks of crust sliding horizontally past each other, capable of producing earthquakes in the magnitude 7 to 8 range. Normal faults involve 1 block of crust dropping downward relative to the other, typically associated with areas where the crust is being pulled apart. Thrust faults, sometimes called reverse faults, involve 1 block of crust being pushed up and over the other as 2 sections of crust collide and compress, a mechanism responsible for some of the most powerful earthquakes on the planet, including major subduction zone events. Understanding which category a given fault falls into helps researchers predict not just how large an earthquake it might produce, but also the specific character of that shaking, since different fault types tend to rupture the surface and shake the ground above them in genuinely different ways. Let me bring these 4 stories together now because I think laying them out side by side illustrates something genuinely important about how earthquake science actually works across this entire country. The Tintina Fault in the Yukon represents a fault whose true hazard was recently reassessed upward based on new geological mapping, despite a quiet recent seismic record. The Hayward Fault in California represents a well-documented, historically active fault, currently sitting past its average recurrence interval, continuing to be studied through updated rupture scenario modeling. The newly discovered New Jersey Fault represents ongoing discovery in a historically undermapped region, adding genuinely new information to scientists' understanding of East Coast seismic hazard. And the new Madrid seismic zone represents a well-known, historically catastrophic fault system, whose greatest danger may lie less in its earthquake probability and more in the region's comparative lack of earthquake-resistant infrastructure. 4 different faults, 4 different stories, 4 different lessons, but all of them reflecting the same underlying truth about earthquake science in 2026. This is a field of continuous, active research, constantly refining what we know about where and how the ground beneath this country is capable of moving. I also want to point y'all toward the actual tools scientists and journalists use to verify stories exactly like the 4 I have covered this morning, because I think it empowers y'all to fact-check future earthquake headlines yourselves rather than relying purely on secondhand reporting. The USGS maintains a public, searchable earthquake catalog, letting anybody search historic seismicity by time window, magnitude, and geographic area, with the results available as an interactive map or downloadable data. The agency also maintains dedicated compilations, specifically covering significant earthquakes, notable earthquake sequences and swarms, and fault zones of particular scientific interest, exactly the kind of resource that let me verify the specific historical details behind today's Hayward Fault and New Madrid seismic zone segments. For California specifically, the state's own fault activity map provides detailed, searchable information on mapped fault traces across the entire state, a genuinely useful companion tool to the EQ ZAP address lookup tool I have mentioned in previous videos covering California's regulatory fault zones. So let me address the urgent framing one more time directly, because I want to leave y'all with a clear, honest final word on it. None of these 4 stories represents an imminent, precisely timed threat. Earthquake prediction, meaning forecasting the exact day, location, and magnitude of a future rupture, remains outside current scientific capability for every single fault I have described this morning, from the remote Yukon wilderness to the heart of the San Francisco Bay Area. What genuinely is urgent, in the sense that actually matters for y'all's safety, is making sure your own household preparedness reflects the real, well-documented hazard in your own specific region, regardless of whether this week's headlines happen to be talking about it. Let me give you all practical, region-specific guidance based on everything I have covered this morning. If you live anywhere across the Yukon or interior Alaska, particularly near Dawson City, this new Tintina Fault research is worth following, as regional hazard assessments and building codes potentially get updated in response to it. If you live anywhere across the San Francisco Bay Area, especially near Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, or Fremont, the Hayward Fault deserves your genuine, ongoing attention. And I would encourage you to check whether your own home has been seismically retrofitted, particularly if you live in an older structure. If you live anywhere across the broader New York City metropolitan area, including New Jersey, understand that earthquake risk in this region, while considerably lower in frequency than California's, is not zero, and basic preparedness, knowing how to shut off gas, securing heavy furniture, remains worthwhile even in a region most people do not associate with earthquakes. And if you live anywhere across the central Mississippi Valley, including Memphis, St. Louis, Nashville, or the surrounding region, I want you taking the New Madrid seismic zone seriously specifically, because building codes across much of this region have historically lagged behind the more rigorous seismic standards found in California, meaning the actual structural risk to your home may be higher than the raw earthquake probability alone would suggest. I also want to remind you all of the standing universal preparedness steps that apply no matter which of these 4 regions you call home. Keep a stocked emergency kit with water, non-perishable food, and a flashlight. Know how to shut off your gas and water utilities if shaking ever damages a line. Secure heavy furniture, bookshelves, and water heaters against tipping. And take a few minutes to check whatever regional or state geological survey covers your specific area, since agencies like the USGS, the UC Berkeley Seismology Lab, and Canada's own Geological Survey continue publishing updated hazard information as research, like all 4 of today's stories, continues to develop. I will keep watching for updates on all 4 of these fault systems. And if any of them produces genuinely significant new activity or new research, I will bring y'all a dedicated, deeper breakdown, the same way I have for individual fault stories on this channel before. If this roundup helped you understand the real current state of fault research across this country without the exaggerated panic a headline like this one might otherwise imply, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I want to keep bringing y'all the complete, honest picture behind stories like these. Share this video with anybody you know living across the Yukon, the Bay Area, the New York metropolitan region, or the central Mississippi Valley, because understanding your own specific region's real documented earthquake hazard is exactly the kind of information that helps people prepare thoughtfully rather than either panicking or ignoring a risk that genuinely does deserve their attention. I will keep watching the data for y'all, and I will see y'all in the next one. Stay informed, stay prepared, and I love y'all.